Is this kind of a technical win in a sense? What's the significance?
Well, it's significant on paper, but as you allude to, it's far less significant in practice. The details of the ruling are that the WTO has come out and said that the US did break those international regulations by imposing tariffs on more than $230 billion worth of Chinese exports from 2018. Now, the US used something called Section 302 of the 1974 US Trade Act to impose those tariffs, which they said was in retaliation for the theft of intellectual property and forced tech transfer by China. Now, the WTO said that those measures were excessive, that they were discriminatory, and that the US had failed to justify them. The reality is that the United States can and probably will appeal this decision, and when it does so, it will go to an appeals body that has been hobbled by the US itself because it's been blocking the appointment of judges to that appeals board. So essentially that appeal will be kicked into the void and will go nowhere. On the other side of this, there's an argument that many would make that China itself broke WTO regulations by imposing counter tariffs after the US without going through the WTO's adjudication process. So in some respects, this ruling exposes, the ruling by the WTO exposes the WTO and the body's own limitations.
So, Tom, how have both sides responded to the ruling?
Well, China, unsurprisingly, has welcomed the ruling. It says that it hopes that the US abides by the WTO's decision. That seems very unlikely indeed. The US TR, Robert Lighthizer, came out and said that this undermines the WTO further. It shows that it's not fit for purpose, that it is completely inadequate. And in fact, he says it points to why the Trump administration, his team, along with the president, have worked to undermine multilateral organizations like the WTO, which he says, again, are not adequate to take on issues like intellectual property. In terms of the Phase 1 trade deal, Lighthizer says it will not affect, the ruling will not affect that Phase 1 trade deal. He says the US must be allowed to defend itself from unfair trade practices. Now, in terms of what this means, again, for the WTO, for China, and for the US more broadly, we heard from Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute. He said that essentially all of these three parties come out of this as losers, particularly at the World Trade Organization.